All right, so it's great to see you. We've got a very interesting class coming up and I say that because it's almost not typical of what we've been studying in the Tanya. The Tanya has been all about, for the most part, positivity and finding the ways that we need to serve God and happiness and being joyful and finding ways to get rid of the sadness. And yet, in this week's class, we're actually going to learn ways to become sad. And that's kind of strange. Um, just one second. That wasn't going okay. Okay, it's just not updating. Okay. So so the question is, what is going on? What is going to be with all the sadness? Why are we going to study about sadness? And the answer is going to be is really, and this is an important rule in life, is that everything has an exception. Although we've been discussing, the great pathways towards, um, if we meditate about God and we think about God, and we had two different meditations, either deep meditation or a meditation that, focuses on our latent love of God. But we have all these different meditations that should bring us to loving God. And the question is, what if they're not working? We're in the troubleshooting section of the Tanya. And the Tanya basically is going to say, you know what? Sometimes things are just not going to work. We actually had that last week as well. Towards the end of the chapter, we discussed that there are some times where you just have to pray to God. Things are not going to work. And so that's the same thing over here, is that sometimes things are just not going to work. And the advice is going to be very, very interesting. But that's the first point I want to talk about, is that, remember, the Tanya was really the Tanya was really a um, kind of answers he would give people personally. Okay, he would have people come to him for personal spiritual advice and their spiritual growth, and he would give them answers. And so there's the general way we serve God. And so that's the whole beginning of that's the whole setup of chapters 1 through chapters 25 is all the general ways that we serve God. And so that would be his basic answer. You come in and here's my basic answer. Here's how you serve God. This is the basics. These are the nuts and bolts you need to know of how you can serve God, what a mitzvah means, what a sin means, what study of Torah means, all the different elements, and how you can come to a great rapture and connection with God. But then the next chapters are all about what happens when it doesn't work. And those are really other very important questions. And what happens when it doesn't work is not always such a simple, straightforward answer. Um, and that's why there's a different advice given. Just to present it with an interesting story. And I just read this before. There was one time a man who was a great scholar, and he came to a he was not a Chabadnik, but he came to the town. He was not Lubavitch, Chabad, whatever. He came to the town of Lubavitch. This is back in Russia. And while he was there, he decided he's going to go to the synagogue to hear the Lubavitcher Rebbe. At that time, it was the third Lubavitcher Rebbe. We say Chabad Lubavitch. I know it gets confusing, but Chabad and Lubavitch is the same thing. And so he goes into the synagogue, and he hears the Rebbe talking, and he thinks to himself, and he says, "It says our sages tell us that words that emanate from the heart will enter someone else's heart. So if you really mean it, the other person will receive it. It'll penetrate the other person's heart." And he thinks to himself, whatever's being told here is not penetrating me. I'm not getting it. It's not connecting to me. And the Rebbe over there, of course, with a prophetic vision, said, just out loud, he said, well, you have to have a heart in order for it to enter your heart. And his point was that, and the point that I take from the story is yes. So, for example, our sages tell us words that emanate from the heart will enter the heart. But the other person has to be in touch with their heart. If the other person, quote unquote, doesn't have the heart, whatever that means, you could try from today till tomorrow, you'll have a very hard time. And that's the same thing that we're getting to over here, is that we can go through all these different motions and meditation and everything, but there are times where it just won't work. And it's okay. And that's really what I get from just the premise of the question of this chapter. Before we get to the answer, a lot of times the question alone can teach you a lot. And you have to look at the premise of the question. And if something is not working when it's supposed to, that's okay. And you need to go ask your mentors. In this case, again, the Tanya was a collection of questions that he would get. So we can imagine the person entering the Rebbe's private audience that this chapter would answer would be, Rebbe, I tried everything. I tried all the advice you gave me. I read all the books. I followed all the advice, and it's just not working. I don't feel any spiritual connection. And so then he would give him an answer. And there are many cases like that also with our Rebbe as well. And that's what we have to. That's why everybody needs mentors and friends. Is for the most part when you're troubleshooting, right? That's mostly what we need, mentors and friends, right? If we could just follow what's written in the book and everything would work, we don't really need mentors. We need mentors for when things aren't working, or for when we're stuck with indecision, when things aren't straightforward. And so that's the first takeaway that I have from this chapter. That don't ever think to yourself that you're damaged goods because what it says is not working. Well, that's very, very common, and to the point that it's written in the Tanya, to a scenario where someone's spirituality is not working, he's going to give a piece of advice. And a lot of times you may not be aware of what's not working. Going back to that story, that person didn't have a heart. That person wasn't in touch with their emotions in general. So it's not like I've said many times in this Tanya. The Tanya is written generally to healthy people. So if someone is not in touch with their emotions in general, the whole discussion of the Tanya is really not going to help them because they don't experience it. So with that, we are going to jump into the topic of this chapter. And this chapter is really going to go into someone who is not able to feel any spiritual connection to God. Again, it's a troubleshooting chapter. So we're talking about somebody, they sit and they meditate about God. They might go to a JLI class and learn all about what a mitzvah means. They might sit in synagogue and try and pray. They're trying all these things and nothing's working. They don't feel anything. So one response, of course, someone might say, well, so let's just drop it all, right? Okay, but we're not going to that. We're talking about someone who's trying, right? Someone who's trying and really wants it to work. And so what is the advice? So the Hasidic advice you might think would be, well, just keep going at it, be happy. But the Tanya here is actually going to say, oddly enough, even though we've had a bunch of chapters about happiness, is you actually might need to be a little bit sad. Sometimes the only way to break through is through a little bit of sadness. It's a very interesting thought, and we're going to develop it today. But his answer is going to be, if you are having trouble feeling spirituality, you might actually need to employ a little bit of sadness or bitterness. And this is obviously very, very strange for a Chabad Hasidic philosophy, because in Chabad Hasidic philosophy, we generally stay away from sadness. That's been the last bunch of chapters, trying to look for ways to be happy. And happiness is generally a decision. There is a field and school of thought of Jewish teachings that focuses a lot on the negative, so to speak. In other words, there's a field called the Musar, and Musar has many different Musars, but there's an element of Musar, one type and genre of Musar, let's call it, is to focus on the negativity of things. So, for example, it might say, well, think about, the hell that you're going to be burning in. Think about, when you eat food, how disgusting it is. Think about how each sin cuts you off from God, and you'll be, banished forever from the face of God. Or all different, ways of looking at it. And that is one form of Musar, and you can find it online, focusing on all the punishments and all the terrifying things that might happen if we sin. And on a whole, Chabad Hasidic philosophy does not do that. The example is given is, let's say there's a person wearing a sweater, and you want them to take off their sweater. So you can either convince them how bad their sweater is and how much it's going to hurt them, and so therefore they should take off their sweater, or you can make the room very warm, then automatically they take off their sweater. Okay, so the same thing is over here, is we all have things that we do that are not right. So we can either focus and talk about how bad those things are, or we can focus on how good it is when you do good things, and automatically you'll want to drop the bad things. That's kind of the general outlook of Hasidic philosophy versus certain genres of Musar. Certain genres of Musar want to focus on the negative of if you sin, and possibly even the rewards of if you do a mitzvah. And Chabad Chassidic philosophy likes to focus on the relationship and the connection with God, and what each mitzvah, how each mitzvah connects us with God, as we have seen throughout the Tanya. This chapter, though, is going to tell us there are times when you need to eviscerate yourself. There are times when you need to look at yourself in the mirror and say, I'm a terrible person. I'm just really bad. I'm just a horrible, horrible human being. And it's going to give different reasons why you're horrible. And there's multiple different reasons. And it's not going to be what you think it is. It's not going to be, well, you're horrible because you didn't, wake up in the morning on time or whatever. But regardless, the point of the chapter is that we sometimes need to employ sadness in order to have a breakthrough. I want to compare it. I want to give a parable. I'll give a parable to sometimes growth requires cutting everything down. Sometimes in order to grow, you need to be humbled. In order to reach the next step, you need to lose what you have. Like a tree, when you plant a tree, you put the seed in the ground and the seed has to disintegrate to give the nutrients in order to grow a tree out of that area. So the seed has to lose what the seed is in order to become a tree. And so similarly in our lives, there are times where we may be requiring to break ourselves and to lose ourselves in order to grow. And it actually comes from a Zohar. But before I do that, I want to ask what you think about that idea in your personal life. If you've ever felt stuck and sadness has helped propel you forward.
I'll go.
Yeah.
Yeah, I discovered that what you're saying is very factual. I mean, definitely like going through a breakdown before you could get to that breakthrough, right? And then that breakthrough happens in like a instant. I'm sorry, here's my microphone. So yeah, so like my relationships with my mother, very important to me, and I avoided this relationship for a very long time, but it was that when I discovered that it wasn't her, it was me, and through coaching, like having a friend, really kind of going through the analysis, but it was me who did the discovery. It wasn't them telling me what I'm going to find. It was just amazing. And then it's the practice of it afterwards, the
So here's the question as it pertains here. Did sadness play a role? In other words, did you feel sadness over the loss, over the fact that there was no relationship?
there were times. Yeah,
Yeah, in other
there
words,
was
that's what I
definitely
would
times.
imagine. In other words, we that's sometimes where sadness propels our growth. In other words, you might
Oh,
go through life, not the relationship with your mother, and you don't think about it, and then suddenly you feel sad one day, and you're like, I really wish I had that relationship.
yeah, is like I had nowhere to turn to. I wasn't getting, that relationship that I really wanted. So yeah, there was not only sadness but all the other emotions that come with it, like being mad and being angry. All of that was there. But yes.
And I mean, it's an interesting point. Mad and angry will also play a role here as well.
Yeah.
The point is that the so to speak, what we call negative emotions, um, they're negative because they're not pleasant, but they can play a role as well. And that's really going to be the point of this Tanya, is that though these emotions are not pleasant and we don't necessarily seek them out, they can play a role in our lives, particularly when we're at stuck somewhere. You keep trying to be joyous and you keep trying to jump over and just, go through it. Sometimes you need to employ negative emotion to get through it. Okay. So, anybody else has any thoughts? Otherwise, we'll go straight to the Tanya. Um,
Rabbi, can I say something?
yes,
I
yes.
I think that all emotions are necessary for growth, but you have to be balanced and snap out of anything. Even happiness is too much, but sadness is too much, and anger is too much. But if you're never angry, then nothing makes a difference to you. So just if we can avoid being extreme on everything, I think that's a good path to be on, my opinion, not to be too sad, not to be too happy, but to have those feelings in a measured way.
Right. In an ideal world, we would be happy about the correct things and sad about the correct things. They all have their place and a right place. But the problem with emotions is when they're existing in a place where they're being detrimental. So sadness, of course, should play a role. Someone that you love passes away, one should 100% be sad. Some religions are not like that, by the way. I think some local ones might be very against sadness altogether. So Judaism does believe in sadness, just we try to employ them generally in the right moments. And as we saw in the Tanya, we generally don't want to be sad throughout the day. Our general mode of operation should be with happiness. That should be our general mode. But sometimes we not only should be sad, but we actually invite sadness. And we're going to find an example of that here. So let's share. And you get to see a picture of the baby for a second, but let's go on here. Okay. Let me move this out of the way. So here is, and that's, we're at chapter 29, but I think I went too far. No, that is the correct way. Here it is, chapter 29. Okay. So here we are. As the Tanya has explained at length, every person is capable of becoming a Beinoni, achieving. No, this is the wrong section. I need to refresh this. Let's open this. Okay, sorry.
That was correct, Rabbi.
Was it?
Yeah, that's where we left off. Chapter 29.
Yeah. I was on the wrong page of chapter 29. Okay. All right. Oh, no, you're right. Here it is. Okay. As the Tanya explained, at length, every person is capable of becoming a Beinoni, achieving self-mastery in areas of thought, speech, and action. But what the Beinoni cannot necessarily sustain is enthusiasm over what he is doing. Enthusiasm is especially necessary in two areas: A, prayer, which is the service of the heart, and B, delaying gratification from permissible activities. I'm not sure. That's commentary. I'm not sure where he got that from. Personally, I think everybody wants enthusiasm. It's helpful in all areas of your growth. If you want to inspire yourself to study Torah, do mitzvos, enthusiasm is, it's very hard to what they call white knuckling. It's very hard to just push through. You want to have enthusiasm, maybe not all the time, but sometimes. So he says like this. However, there's one other key area in which aspiring or actual Beinoni need to take counsel from the souls. When periodically and frequently your heart is desensitized, timtum alev means the heart is closed up to spirituality, as if it were a stone, and you cannot find any way to emotionally connect with prayer, the service of the heart. And also you are sometimes unable to put up a fight against the evil inclination, to sanctify yourself to that which is permissible to you, to delay gratification and possibly stay from permissible activities due to a sluggishness in the heart. So he does connect those two. But regardless, I also think that it's something general that one would be interested in. In other words, we would generally be interested in the ability to be spiritually sensitive and want to feel a closeness to God. So here we're talking to a person who, let's say, walks into the private eye and says, Rabbi, I'm trying all the advice and I'm not feeling anything. So, and I obviously explained the problem till now before in my introductions. He says, in such a case, the following prescribed plan is cited in the Holy Zohar. What the head of the heavenly yeshiva said. All right, so we're gonna get a sneak peek into what happens in the yeshiva in heaven. All right, so what does it say? If a wooden beam won't ignite, give out its light, crush it, and it will ignite. So what that means is, if you're at a campfire and the log is not lighting, you need to break up the log into smaller pieces. It's too big. It's not going to catch fire unless you had already a big flame, but it's not going to catch fire. You need to break it up into pieces in order for it to catch fire. And so the Heavenly Academy says, similarly, if a body won't give out light of its soul, crush it, and the soul's light will come out. So just as a log, you need to crush the log in order for it to catch on fire. If your soul is not catching on fire, you need to crush your soul. You need to crush yourself. Now, it doesn't mean physically to crush yourself, but spiritually. The meaning of the Zohar's phrase, a body won't give out light of its soul, is that your soul and your intelligence won't shine their light sufficiently to curb your body's sensuous urges. And though your mind does appreciate the greatness of God and meditates in it, your mind still fails to grasp and absorb God's greatness to the extent that it could curb your heart's sensuous urges because of the sensuality and vulgarity of both your mind and your heart. So what he's saying here is like this. He is saying, if you are actually spending the time to think about God, so we're not talking about someone who doesn't take that time, okay? Then we just say, all right, start off with step number one, try to meditate about God. But someone who's meditating about God, meditating about all the concepts we've been talking about till now, and you think about it, and nevertheless, whatever's going on in your mind, you don't end up feeling it. His explanation is, what that means is that your animal soul is so hyperactive, it's so large, like that wood, it's so big that it's so focused on the physicality, it is not allowing your godly soul to shine. If you recall, we've discussed in the Tanya, we have a godly soul and an animal soul, but we've also said that the godly soul is enmeshed within the animal soul. The animal soul operates our body, and the godly soul has to become enmeshed within the animal soul. The animal soul is the more physical soul, so it has a closer connection to the body. So what he's saying here is if you are not feeling spirituality, that's because you're feeling too much of your body. And you're feeling too much of your animal soul. Your animal soul is too strong. And so that's what he says. And he says, so despite your efforts at meditation, you don't have a spiritual awakening due to the vulgarity of the klipa in your mind and your heart, which exerts itself over the soul's holy light, hiding back and blocking its light from illuminating the rest of your body. So in other words, your godly soul might be doing a good job, but you're not going to feel it because your animal soul is blocking it. So you can meditate from today to tomorrow, but if your animal soul is too big, you're not going to let it in. Now, just to make this practical to many of us, very, very simple point over here is, a very simple point that comes down from here is, if you're trying to be spiritual, but at the same time you're trying to be super physical, you're going to have trouble feeling that spirituality. If you are way too involved in this world in a very coarse way, spirituality is going to become very hard for you. Real spirituality, real spirituality, godly spirituality. That's one thing that comes out from here. Now, this Tanya could be talking to someone who's not too involved in the physical, but just naturally their animal soul is powerful. But regardless of why your animal soul is powerful, whether you're feeding it too much or whether it's just that's the way it is, his advice is going to be, you need to crush it. That's where sadness comes. You need to crush it, because ultimately, what is the greatest tool of the animal soul? Is the ego. As long as you feel ego, you will not allow God in. Ego means a feeling of self. The more you feel self, the more you're not going to allow God in. And so when you crush yourself, you don't feel self anymore. That's why they say there's no atheist in a foxhole, because the person doesn't feel themselves anymore. So automatically their godly soul can shine. But we don't have to go into a foxhole to feel God. We can find other ways to stop feeling ourselves so much. And that's going to be basically his advice, is find ways to almost denigrate yourself, is really what his advice here is. Almost find ways to denigrate yourself. And that way you feel yourself less. And that will allow your godly soul to shine. So he says like this: as we learned in chapter 29, the chokhmah, the wisdom in your divine soul, is a permanent window to God which can never be obscured. But the klipa can do is block the chokhmah's energizing influence on the rest of the soul, so that the chokhmah itself remains trapped and exiled. The Zohar's advice teaches you how to cause that light, which is already present in your soul, to shine in your mind and your heart. And so he says, how does that work? That's why the Zohar advises you ought to metaphorically crush the body and raise it to the ground, which means practically you ought to schedule ego-deflating sessions so that your body's sensuality and vulgarity become, in the words of the scripture, disgusting in your eyes and repulsive. Very interesting. All right, so here we have a question. Is the idea of getting motivated by sadness meant specifically in the context of our connection with God, or does it apply more generally? Considering that we, as Jewish people, consider everything we do possibly to be godly. So I would say it can apply more generally in your life. If whatever you're trying to accomplish is what God wants, then sure, you might utilize it. It might also work for people who aren't trying to seek godliness, but I would say that the concept can be true, because ultimately, really everything we do should be to serve God, and it could energize all areas of our life. I'm guessing. This is my guess. So let's say I'm having trouble at work, working really hard. The animal soul is usually the source of laziness. The godly soul is the source of energy. Why do I need to work? I need to make a living, and I need to support everything on my Jewish life. So it could be your animal soul slowing you down over there. And so you need to break yourself to allow your godly soul to shine. It's a theory. I think it's correct, but I don't know. So anyways, his point is that we need to schedule times to lose our ego. Now, I want to share a story here. This story is very important, because what it's going to tell us is this story is that in ego deflating exercises, we have to be careful as well. And he's going to give very specific exercises. But the story I want to share goes like this. There was one time back in the day, many people used to believe that if they, torture themselves, they'll become more spiritual. So if they fast and they roll in the snow and they don't eat too much, they're going to become more spiritual. And the Chabad Chassidic philosophy generally did not believe in that. That was not our path. And you'll see that here as well. We're not going to be into torturing our body, so to speak, in order to become more spiritual. If anything, the more spiritual person doesn't want to get too involved in the physicality, but the torture part, that's really what we're not about. Okay, people used to literally torture their bodies, fasting for the sake of torturing, to break themselves. And we're not into that. And just to tell it with a story, there was one time a man came to the Baal Shem Tov, and he used to fast, and he used to roll in the snow, and all different things to torture his body. And so he thought he was some holy man. And so the Baal Shem Tov took him outside, brought him to the horse stable, and he said, "Look, here's an old horse. He rolls in the snow. He some days can't eat, but he's still a horse." What was the Baal Shem Tov's point? Is just because you torture yourself doesn't mean you're not a horse. You could be a real horse, a fair horse. I mean, you could be an animal. You could be an animal and torturing yourself. If the goal of the torturing is, wow, look what a great person I am. Look how special I am. Look at how magnificent I am. I roll in the snow and I fast. I'm so great. I'm so spiritual. You're not going to get anywhere, because you're just feeding your ego. And the exercises that are here are about pointing out how we're not so great. That's really what the point of this exercise, not to torture myself, but to point out that I'm not as great as I think I am. That's really what makes this exercise different from possibly other exercises. It's not about torturing myself so that I become, I think I'm so spiritual. It's actually telling yourself that you're not as great as you think you are. That's really what I would think of it. So let's take a look here on the text. So what type of things would you tell yourself? There's actually many things you could tell yourself. And we're going to start with one, which is an odd one, because it's actually not necessarily true. But let's read it and then I'll explain it. So it says like this. And as we learned the above Zohar's insight on the Psalms, that a heart that is broken leads to a broken spirit, this negative energy is the Sitra Achra. So again, sorry, I missed out words. A heart that is broken dismantles the negative energy field that surrounds you. And this negative energy is the Sitra Achra. So interestingly, so a broken heart dismantles the negative energy that surrounds you. And there was a great Hasidic Rebbe called the Rebbe of Kutsk. He was known for very sharp lines. And he once said, there is nothing as whole as a broken heart. There's nothing as whole as a broken heart. Interesting. So anyways, over here, you might have a negative energy around you. Let's read the commentary here. In chapter 17 and chapter 26, we learned that a negative energy field is brought about through sins and is broken through remorse over them. But here the Tanya applies the idea not to sinful behavior, which is of course absent in the Beinoni, but to the person himself who ought to do schedule ego-deflating sessions to see himself as disgusting and repulsive. But where did this negative energy come from, if not from sin? And why is the session of introspection directed at the person and not his negative energy? So here we're talking about, again, to be very specific, we had earlier sessions where your sins are causing your negative energy. But let's say it's not necessarily your sins. Here, it's not the cause of your sins. It's literally just your animal soul itself. In this case, you need to direct your introspection at the person. Interesting. So let's take a look. Because in the case of the Beinanim, which the Beinoni is someone who never sins, the negative energy, the Sitra Achra, is identified with the actual person himself. People who sin acquire a negative energy field as a result of their behavior. But in a less pronounced way, the Beinoni has a pre-existing negative energy built into his system at birth. Since the energizing animal soul which gives life to his body remains in its innate strength as it was at birth in a Beinoni's heart. So the negative energy field is not something acquired, it's an integral person to himself. So what does that mean? That means sins can introduce a negative energy to me. But then I also have, and even if I have sinned, okay, putting that aside, the only difference between a Rasha, a wicked person, and a Beinoni in this context is that a Beinoni will never introduce a negative energy field. It's only his innate negative energy field, whereas a Rasha can also introduce a negative energy field. But what this is saying here is that in addition to possibly negative energy fields we can invite to ourselves through our sins, which we discussed chapter 17 and chapter 25, we can also have a natural negative energy field that is natural to us, but just by virtue of having an animal soul. So again, a tzaddik, a righteous person, will not have this, because a righteous person has no animal soul. But us, the rest of the people who have animal souls, even if we're not really sinning, the animal soul itself can be a negative energy field that prevents us from feeling spirituality. So let's continue. Let me read this line again, now that I said that. Since the energizing animal soul, which gives life to the body, remains in its innate strength as it was at birth in the Beinoni's heart, so the negative energy field is not something acquired, it's an integral part of the person himself. And therefore, you need to break yourself, because it's part of you. By directing the spirit-breaking power of remorse and introspection towards his actual self, the Beinoni can shatter the inner negative energy field that is preventing his mind and heart from being enthusiastic about worship. However, this leads us with a further question. Have we not learned that a person has not one but two selves, divine and animal? So why then does the Tanya associate the self here only with the animal soul? You wrote here, this seems like a natural progression of events. I'm not sure. You have to explain that more. Okay. The question here is like this. For anybody who studied Tanya long enough, we keep telling you that the real you is your godly soul. So how could I even say that my animal soul is me? And the answer is that the truth is that the real you is your godly soul. But as you are in this world, you don't necessarily feel it. Because when you're not a tzaddik, when you're not a righteous person, the godly soul has to operate through your animal soul. So automatically, the way we will feel automatically is more identified with our animal soul. Though the reality is the real me is my godly soul. When I pass away, I only have my godly soul. That's the real me. That's the true me. But that true me is not latent in my day-to-day life. And that is why he's going to say, in our prayers, we say, the godly soul that you put into me, which implies there's a me and there's a godly soul that comes into me. What that means is, in this context, is that I have to view myself sometimes as an animal soul with a godly soul that's in it. So let's read that. It's an interesting point. So he says, regarding the divine soul, we say the divine soul which you placed in me is pure. The text is precise in stating the divine soul is placed in me, implying that you yourself are not the pure soul, since the divine soul was placed into yourself. While it is true that you have two souls, you only have one self, the self being whichever consciousness represents your core identity. Beinanim, intermediate, and Rishayim, wicked people, still identify primarily with their bodies and the animal souls, and they see the divine soul as an influence more than an identity. And that's why the ego-deflating session for the Beinoni can be directed simply at the self, since by default this will target the body and animal soul. So think about it ourselves. Okay, this is text. Think about yourself. Who do you identify with more? Who is the you that you think of? I can personally say the me is generally the me that wants to sleep and wants to eat and wants physical things. The drive for spirituality is like something I need to push myself into. So I can fully relate with what the Tanya is saying, is that the natural me is not my spiritual soul. Though I know that is truly who I am, that's a knowledge. That's not how I feel. I feel as the me, the animal soul. That's the me that I feel. And therefore, I can direct my anger and my breaking, my self-deflating session at me because I identify with the animal soul. See what you're saying. Okay, I'll get to that comment in a second. Good point. All right, so let me just continue this idea over here. He says, except in the case of tzaddikim, righteous people, for it is the other way around, and the pure soul, the divine soul is itself, while at tzaddikim, their bodies no longer represent their core identity, and they relate to their body as mere human flesh. So a tzaddik is someone who views themselves as their godly soul because they don't have an animal soul. It's gone, or it's so minimized they don't feel it. And this, by the way, gives us again an inkling into what a tzaddik is. We've spoken many times about what a tzaddik is. Put very simply, the difference between a tzaddik and a Beinoni, or shall I say the difference between a tzaddik, a really righteous person, and us, is who are they? Who do they identify with? Who is their real drive? Who is the real passion? Who is the real them? For a tzaddik, literally they identify as the godly soul. That is who they are. They identify as the godly soul, to the point where they view bodily functions as a, I don't want to say a necessary evil, but let's say a necessary evil. They don't view eating lunch like we view lunch. We view lunch like, I'm hungry, man, I want to eat. Now I have to think, I want to eat so I can serve God. That's my secondary thought. My first thought is I want to eat, right? A tzaddik says, I want to serve God. Oh my gosh, I need to live. I need to eat. But they don't really want to eat. They want to serve God. So they need to eat. Let's take a look here. The Tanya actually says that this was actually how Hillel described himself when he wanted to eat. We see this language used by Hillel the elder to his disciples, that when going to eat, he used to say that he was going to perform an act of kindness to a poor, miserable creature, referring to his body, because it was like a stranger to him, in the sense that it was not his core identity. And that's why he would say that in feeding it, he was doing an act of kindness towards his body, because his self was identified exclusively with his divine soul. Okay. He is exclusively defined and related to his divine soul. I don't think any of us think like that. I don't think any of us think when we're going to eat that we're doing a favor to our body to allow it to exist. And now I don't want people to confuse this with some other religions that believe in asceticism, believe in separating ourselves from the world. Jewish philosophy views that the fact that we are born the way we are born as a feature, not a flaw, as a feature and not a bug. In other words, though tzaddikim are created almost in a ascetic way, ascetic means people are separated, people who really don't feel their bodily functions that much. They're kind of secondary to their primary personality. They are created as the minority for a reason, because they really are on this earth to inspire us. But the vast majority of people are not created like that. The vast majority of people are created that we feel our body. Because, again, it's a feature, it's not a bug. God wanted that we should primarily feel our body and then bring holiness into it, because that's the only way to really make a physical world into the spiritual. In other words, if we were primarily spiritual beings that felt that we didn't need to eat and we were only eating to be able to live, then we would not be elevating this world. there's no elevation happening because we're almost not worldly beings. A tzaddik is, in a real sense, almost not a worldly being. They happen to live in this earth. They happen to have a body and a soul, but they're almost angelic. That's why we say they're like an angel. They're like an angel of God, because they really are. The difference is God created them in a way that they have a body and they are bound by their body and they are limited by their body. And that's why we can relate to them. But to a very large extent, us and them think totally differently. They can understand us and they can relate to us, unlike angels who totally don't understand us because they don't even eat. They don't understand the bodily functions at all. But tzaddikim are kind of this semi state between an angel and a person. But we are not like that. We are created very much identifying with our animal soul, and it's a feature. It's a feature because that's the only way that we're going to elevate this world. If the world was filled with tzaddikim, because till now, till you learn the Tanya, you think a tzaddik is just someone who always does the right thing. No, a tzaddik is someone who's totally different caliber. They don't even feel their animal soul. And if the world was full of tzaddikim, God has no mission in this earth. God's mission in this earth is to take people like me and you, who primarily feel our bodily functions, and then have to say, you know what, this thing that I want to eat right now, I'm going to make it a godly thing. That's the ultimate making a home for God in a very lowly place. We have to feel that lowly level. Nevertheless, despite the above said point, and that God made us like this, and it's purposeful, and there's a reason for it, and there's nothing to be depressed about that, when you're at a point right now where your animal soul, which you identify with, is getting in your way, you have to spend a moment and put, so to speak, your animal soul in its place. That's really what this chapter is about. Number one, it's understanding that we primarily identify with our animal soul as non-tzaddikim. That's not necessarily a problem, but in some cases it can create issues, and in those times we need to break our animalistic soul and our animalistic self. So he continues like this. Above, chapter 28, however, we learned that the divine soul cannot influence the body directly, but does so through the medium of the animal soul into, I'm going to get to the comment once I finish the section, into which it must dress. How then is it possible for a tzaddik, for a righteous person, to identify exclusively with his divine soul? And his answer is because in the case of a tzaddik, his body and flesh are energized by the divine soul alone, since the evil within his energizing animal soul, dressed in his flesh and blood, has been transformed to good. And in the case of tzaddikim, the transformed animal soul has been completely absorbed in the divine soul. Okay, he's just explaining the tzaddik, which we are not. And by the way, I just want to say, that is why we say about righteous people, it says even when they die, they're not really dead. Why? Because there's really no part of them that dies. They always identified with their godly soul, and after they die, they also identify with our godly soul. When we die, there's an element of us that dies. The part of us that liked the vacations, and the part of us that liked the pizza, and the part of us that liked that liked a hot bath and a good shower. Those parts of us do die when we die, because we identify very much with the physicality of the world. Spiritual people, when they die, they've just shed their body, so to speak. I know that sounds really weird, but that is how we look at it. As we look at a tzaddik, so to speak, when they're alive, they're encumbered by their body, and when they die, they're not encumbered by their body. And it's really a tzaddik passing away is a loss to the world, but for the tzaddik themselves, it's not as much of a loss, which is actually probably true of anybody. The difference is, though, we perceive the loss of our physical pleasures as some type of loss. But that's off tangent. He says, but in the case of a Beinoni, since his energizing animal soul dressed in his flesh and blood has a deep core of Sitra Achra, which hasn't been transformed to good, that constitutes the Beinoni's actual identity. And then he's going to say, since your identity is your animal soul, you can crush your animal soul. All right, now I want to get to the question here. All right, so question number one is, we're talking about someone who has already tried everything to achieve connection, yet nothing has worked. In that case, sadness will likely arise naturally. So my answer to that is very possible that the person will not be sad naturally. In other words, it's possible that the person has such a negative energy field that they won't feel sadness. In other words, they might know it's not working, but they won't feel sadness over it. It's possible. The person's animal soul might be so strong that they will not be feeling sadness. But if that alone brings you sadness, that sadness might work for you. But if your animal soul is so coarse And it's like, the word indifferent. It almost feels like okay, it didn't work. No, it's in your mind, something's not working, but in your heart, you're not feeling the sadness. That's when the meditations here might be useful. That would be my thought about that question. Didn't Yaakov feel happy in his feelings of humility after being robbed of his pride? Right. Okay, so we're going to discuss that after sadness, or what you call here as well as humility, comes joy, and that's correct. The follow-up to any type of sadness and humility will be joy. And that's very simply stated. You can think of it because the moment you employ the sadness, that brings to humility, which lowers your animal soul's power, and automatically you allow the spiritual light into yourself, and therefore you automatically become more joyous. Okay, so let's continue. So we have established we're talking to a person who is having trouble feeling godliness. Why are they feeling trouble feeling godliness? Not because of their sins. It's a separate discussion. We can deal with sins as well. We basically said you have to deal with sins as well. So sins can stop you from feeling godliness. But let's say it's just literally your animal soul is just too powerful. And we added on here, why can your animal soul get in the way of your godly soul? Because your godly soul has to operate through your animal soul. And so the godly soul may not be penetrating. And we're talking as well, we established we're talking to a person who identifies primarily with their animal soul. That's what they feel day to day and day out. And therefore, his final step here is going to be, if you crush your animal soul, you'll be able to allow yourself to feel your godly soul. So let's continue. And this being the case, his identity is as far from God as can be. For even though the Beinoni has achieved total mastery over his external garments, his animal soul's appetite has not been fundamentally transformed at its deep core and is fully capable of craving for things forbidden by the Torah that violate God's will. So again, we're talking to someone possibly who is not currently sinning. They're making the right choices. So why are they not feeling the spirituality? Because he's saying, even if you make the right choices don't mean you have changed your animal soul. It just means you've overridden your animal soul. You haven't changed it. So his point is going to be, your animal soul is just as disgusting as it always has been. So on this practical external level, the Beinoni is very close to God as he makes sure his garments are always aligned with God. But at the level of his animal soul's deep core, his real identity, he is as far from God as can be. Let's continue. And even if he doesn't desire to actually do forbidden acts, rather it's just that he doesn't find them utterly repulsive like righteous people do, then he is still as far from God as can be because his animal soul remains his core identity, and that soul is derived from the Sitra Achra. As we explained above, that as long as you are not repulsed by evil, the Sitra Achra still has a hold over your animal soul. And that's where we explained the difference between a tzaddik and a Beinoni. Anyways, let me continue. In this respect, that his core personality is still drawn to acts that violate God's will, he is inferior to non-kosher animals, more disgusting than insects, and more repulsive than reptiles, as mentioned above in chapter 24. So this is one meditation to crush yourself. It's saying, practically, my feelings, my thoughts, my desires are more repulsive than animals. Animals only want to do the will of God. But I desire things that go against the will of God. God doesn't want me to sin. I desire to sin. As the verse states, I am a worm and not a man, in my desired behavior, and therefore I am the shame of humanity and disgrace of a nation. That was a meditation that King David wrote. Let's take a look at the practical lesson on the left side. If you find yourself emotionally desensitized to Judaism in general, and in prayer in particular, you might need to have a tough conversation with yourself to deflate your ego. By talking critically to your body and animal soul, you can break its negative energy field and resensitize yourself. While you have two souls, your core identity is your animal soul. So if you are harsh on yourself, that energy will automatically be directed to the animal soul. In other words, you may be feeling good about yourself because you're generally a good person. But as long as you're feeling good about yourself, that may unfortunately lead to allowing yourself to feel yourself too much, allow your animal soul to retain its strength, and not allow your godly soul to go through. So oddly enough, it's almost like an anti-self-esteem thing over here. Self-esteem can sometimes be detrimental, because if your self-esteem focuses too much on how good you are, then at some point it might feed into your animal soul, and it might make your ego too big. And that's what this is about. It's telling you, you're not as good as you think you are. Even if you think you're good because you make the right decisions, know that inside you're rotten to the core. Is basically basically his argument here is, even if you make the right decisions, know that your desires are still rotten. In other words, though it is a perfectly correct analysis to say, okay, so what? My inner core is rotten, but I'm making the right decisions. But again, we're talking in a moment when you need to have self-deflating talk. Generally, you don't talk to yourself like that. Generally, you should tell yourself, I'm making the right decisions. That is a good thing. We're talking in a moment, again, this is troubleshooting, in a moment when things aren't working for you. At those moments, we need to flip how we talk to ourselves. All right, and he says like this, and even when the Bainani's divine soul gains strength during prayer and arousing a passionate love, it is not absolutely authentic in a perfect sense since it dissipates and goes away after prayer, as mentioned above at the end of chapter 13. All right. So his first piece of advice, and we're going to give another way of crushing ourselves in the following weeks. But the first piece of advice is basically telling you think you're so great because you're generally a good person. You're not so great. You are inside, you're rotten. Now you might say, Rabbi, why are you telling me this? I make the right decisions. Because you're not trying to crush your godly soul. You're trying to crush your animal soul. You need to talk, basically, you're talking to your animal soul. When you tell yourself, I'm rotten, you're talking to your animal soul, telling, hey, animal soul, stop being so big. You're rotten. You're a rotten piece of anything, It's not okay. You're completely out of control. I get it. You never make it. We never choose to do the wrong thing, but that's not on you. That's on me. Which whatever. Now we get into confusing who is the real me. We're gonna be like schizophrenics over here. But the idea is the point again. I don't know how exactly you want to talk to yourself, but the point that I gather from it is he gives a very specific idea. The point that I gather from it is ego and too much self-importance will always get in our way. So though we have meditations to not get down when we realize that we're not a tzaddik, we also have to be very careful with those thoughts not to allow ourselves to become big-headed and think too much of ourselves. And that's really what I think the message here is that if we're not feeling spirituality, we might be feeling too much of ourselves. And when we feel too much of ourselves, then we're having a problem. In general, the Jewish self-esteem. So one way of self-esteem is saying, I am good, I am great, I am wonderful. The Jewish self-esteem is, wow, the real me is something really special, a gift that God has given me. There's a self-esteem that comes with humility. And it's hard to really pull that out, but that's the self-esteem that is ultimately required of us. We have to change, and that's how I believe that Tanya is talking to. It's talking really to someone who has a self-esteem that's not part of humility. And to that person, the Alter Rebbe comes to him and says, hold off. You're not as great as you think you are. You still have horrible desires. Don't think of yourself as so big-headed. A self-esteem that comes with humility says, wow, God has given me this gift of the godly soul. And though I struggle my entire life, I have this beautiful gift of this innate feeling and love of God. And that soul can always connect to God. And so it's a gift that you accept with humility, not saying, I worked so hard and therefore I deserve, all the pats on the back. It's more like recognizing the blessings that we have and wanting to reciprocate to God because of those blessings. That's kind of how I would take this chapter. Understanding, so to speak, there's healthy self-esteem, and sometimes we have an unhealthy self-esteem, even if it might be rooted in spirituality. That's really what I also gather from here. In other words, this person had a self-esteem rooted in spirituality. This person was telling themselves, look, I'm so good. I always make the right decision. I always choose to do the right thing. And the Alter was telling them, but if that causes you to have an inflated ego, so to speak, think too much about yourself, that might be what's getting in the way of your spiritual and divine service. And so you need to find ways sometimes to deflate your ego and bring more humility into your life. We'll stop here, and next week we're going to get to another reason why you might not be feeling spiritual sensitivity, and that might be due to sins. Even if you have already repented on those sins, they still might be getting in the way. That's going to be next week's discussion. But this week, again, we discussed when I would say your ego, and you may not realize it, but when your ego and inflated, a self-esteem that is not based in humility is really how I look at it. That might be what's getting in the way of your spirituality. A self-esteem that is not based in humility, and you need to crush yourself sometimes to bring you back to a state of humility and gratitude. And then you will allow yourself to feel the spirituality in your life. And with that, I will stop the recording. If I can
Rabbi,
find the
can I
button.
ask you a question? And I'm glad you stopped